Week 14 for wide receivers is here, and we might not be missing any superstars this weekend, but with the buys, we are definitely missing some depth that we may need to replace. But on Thursday Night Football this week, we have Dallas at Detroit, and we already have some star power that could provide us a lot of fantasy points right off the bat. And we might as well kick this show off with a bang and make this matchup our underdog must-watch matchup of the week for the wide receiver position. George Pickens, CeeDee Lamb, Jameson Williams. Will Amon-Ra St. Brown be able to go? He's making it sound like he's going to give it a shot, but that's why we have to pay close attention to what happens in this matchup. But if you own CeeDee Lamb or George Pickens, you should be solid. If you own Jameson Williams, you should also be solid, especially if there's no Amon-Ra St. Brown. And if you want to start off your week 14 by seeing some green over on Underdog, you're going to be able to use some of these wide receivers. But the only way to be able to do that is to get signed up over on Underdog and use our code HEADLINERS when you create a new account and deposit at least $10. When you do that and you play your first $5 game over on Underdog, you're going to get bonus bets up to $100 and a super special pick'em that you can pair with these wide receivers that's almost guaranteed to hit. The Detroit Lions are allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. The Dallas Cowboys are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Dallas's defense has been a little bit better as of late, but over the last 4 games, they're still allowing the 10th most fantasy points. Seattle at Atlanta, and JSN owners were not super excited about the performance they got last week, but everybody has a down performance. JSN has been so good this season that it's okay. I think we can go ahead and cut him some slack here. I saw a couple of people that were like, oh, I missed out on my first round bye because of JSN. I'd be willing to bet that the only reason you were even in a position for a first round bye is because of JSN. And we are still waiting to hear more about Drake London because that's going to really depend on whether or not we want to try and risk it with him this week, even if he does play. I know he's going to be giving it a shot, and originally when he got injured, they were talking about him missing just a couple of weeks. So I think there is a chance that he could return this week. But make sure you check back throughout the week here on the Headliners so we can keep you updated on his status, especially in the rankings show, because if Drake London can end up playing, he most definitely needs to be in our lineup. He's been one of the best wide receivers in the entire NFL when he's been healthy. Cincinnati at Buffalo, and we are going to have to monitor T. Higgins because as of this recording, he is not clear the concussion protocol as of yet. If he does, he will become a start in this matchup going up against Buffalo. The touchdown potential is just way too good. The volume potential with Ja'Marr Chase is always there. Joe Burrow, he shook off a little bit of rust last week. He should be even better this week. I know Cincinnati has been a pretty favorable matchup in terms of fantasy football for a while now, but for the Buffalo Bills wide receivers, I don't really think it makes a whole lot of sense to try and risk it with anyone this week. Keon Coleman, he wasn't even active for 2 straight weeks because of coaches' decisions. That speaks a lot. He came back last week and he did score a touchdown, but he saw very minimal volume. Khalil Shakir has had some very solid matchups and hasn't been able to do anything with those. For right now, I think we just need to look at better options that show us maybe a little bit more upside or at least a little bit more consistency. Tennessee has a terrible matchup against the Cleveland defense this week, and these wide receivers have been anything other than consistent throughout the year. I continue to see comments about DK and that he's been a great sleeper for your fantasy football team, and he's been a consistent option every single week. And for those of you that feel that way about DK, you probably have some settings in your league that are vastly different from a majority of leagues out there. Because yes, in some leagues you can change your settings to allow fantasy points for return yards, which is where DK has been getting those fantasy points from. For those of you that play in leagues that don't allow return yards for individual players, that is where you're not getting any fantasy value from DK. And for a majority of people that watch this channel, they probably aren't playing in that type of league, so it's hard for me to tell anyone to start him because you're going to end up screwing up a majority of the time. So, this is a great reminder. Always make sure you know your league settings because it could allow you to take advantage of a couple of things that your league mates don't always do. Shedeur Sanders hasn't been awful since they made the transition over to him, but we also haven't seen anything at this point either that would say to me, hey Kyle, let's start Jerry Jeudy or Cedric Tillman or Isaiah Bond. One thing Sanders is doing is spreading the ball around, but the number one receiver on this team is Harold Fannin, and then you're still going to be running the football quite a bit with Quinshon Judkins. Maybe one of these guys see a big play every once in a while, but I said this in the running back video. This week, we're going to keep it simple, and keeping it simple is leaving these guys, I was going to say on the bench, but actually probably just on the waiver wire. Washington and Minnesota, and the Vikings are now allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Their defense has been playing incredibly well. Terry McLaurin looked very good in his return last week, and I would love to see some more performances like that, especially for those of you that held on to him, and now you could use him in the fantasy playoffs. But here in week 14, he's going to be capped with very limited upside. Deebo Samuel, to me, has a little bit of a better floor. Terry McLaurin has a shot at a better ceiling because of the big playability, but also at this point in time, we still haven't heard, is it going to be Jaden Daniels or Marcus Mariota? Personally, I do think it's going to be Marcus Mariota this week. I know Justin Jefferson owners would love to see a big game from him, and Washington is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to the opposing wide receiver position. J.J. McCarthy is expected back this week, so that's good news for Justin Jefferson, even though it really hasn't been good news all season long. It's much better than Max Brosmer last week, who gave him only a couple of targets. Let's hope that Justin Jefferson can get back on track if you're still playing him. And for a majority of you out there, you probably are. And with JJ back in such a favorable matchup, I could see Jordan Addison scoring a touchdown as well. For the Dolphins and the Jets this week, I'm going to list Jalen Waddle as a start. Now, over the last couple of games, his performance hasn't been nearly as good as it was right after Tyreek Hill was injured. He's been the wide receiver 39 and the wide receiver 48 each of the last 2 weeks, but this is what happens when Tua is your quarterback. You get a pretty wide range of outcomes. He's lost a lot of the ceiling that we saw right after Hill got injured, but for a while he was giving us one of the better floors of all wide receivers that were kind of outside that top tier of guys. This week, based on the numbers, it's a little bit of a tougher matchup, but Jalen Waddle should still be in our lineup. I'm going to go ahead and give Adonai Mitchell the fringe start designation for this week. It's not a great matchup as Miami is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and the Jets will probably run the ball quite a bit with Breece Hall, but we saw some of that big play potential last week, and Tyrod Taylor is definitely the guy on this team that can get the ball to him the most consistent moving forward. Is he a guy that I'm going to play in my lineup every single week right now? No. But if you're experiencing difficulties at the wide receiver position and you're missing some upside there, he's not the worst guy that you could add off the waivers this week. Chris Olave continues to be such a great floor piece for our fantasy teams in half PPR and full PPR leagues. He gave us another double-digit performance last week. He did score a touchdown, which helped push him inside the top 24, but that's fine because he has been much better over the last several weeks of the season in terms of actual production. He hasn't taken any sort of a hit in targets though, and this is a guy that should be in our lineup every single week moving forward, especially going up against Tampa Bay, whose defense has struggled quite a bit this season. When Vele was traded from the Broncos to the Saints, I did mention him as a deep sleeper option for those of you that played in deep leagues that didn't have a whole lot available on the waiver wire. And so far, he hasn't done a ton with the Saints, but this past week, we saw some potential. Since the bye week, he has a combined 15 targets over the last 2 games. He didn't do a whole lot with those targets a couple of weeks ago, but against Miami, he finally turned them into 93 yards and a touchdown. Do I expect that consistently to end the season? No. But for those of you in deeper leagues, if he is still out there, I would give him a shot. I think there's a big question mark right now on whether or not Emeka Egbuka should be in our lineup consistently. At the beginning of the season, he was a top 10 option for a majority of the year. Then he got banged up a little bit, and since then, he just has not performed the way that he was throughout the first several weeks. Since his wide receiver 1 performance against Seattle, he's been the wide receiver 69, 34, 55. He did have the wide receiver 4 week against New England, but then back down to 44, 50 and 43. Now you've got Chris Godwin back, who looked very solid. And Mike Evans had his 21-day practice window open. Does he return in week 14? Probably not. But if he can come back in week 15, it's going to complicate things even further. Right now, for me, Ibuka has more upside than Chris Godwin still. But Chris Godwin, as of right now, is probably the safer bet. Alec Pierce is probably not going to be the consistent option that you want to play every single week, but he's been very good over the last 4 games. During that time span, he has given us performances of wide receiver 15, 14, and 13. He didn't do much against the Kansas City Chiefs, which that is a tough defense. And Jacksonville, they've been up and down at times this season. But we do know that he can hit a big play at any point in time. This guy is averaging 20.9 yards per reception right now. And if you're looking for a safer option, it's Michael Pittman. He didn't do a whole lot last week. He did have a touchdown the week before against the Kansas City Chiefs, but so far this season, he continues to be pretty steady, and his 7 touchdowns are a career high, and he still has a shot at least double-digit touchdowns to finish the season. For Jacksonville this week, their matchup seems a little bit better. Indianapolis is still allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but now it sounds like they're going to be missing their newest addition, Sauce Gardner, for at least a couple of weeks with an injury. Brian Thomas Jr. was able to return last week, but like he's done a majority of the season, he was very underwhelming. In this matchup, he could end up finding his feet once again and hopefully give us a little bit more fantasy value. But it seems like the number 1 wide receiver on this team right now is Jakobi Meyers. Since the trade, he's actually been very solid. Over the last couple of weeks, he's given us 2 games inside the top 24. He's got back-to-back games with a touchdown, and he has at least 6 targets in each of his last 3 games. For me, Jakobi Meyers is actually a pretty solid start right now. For Pittsburgh and Baltimore, really a lot of this depends on who the quarterback is this week. But even if it's Aaron Rodgers, do we still feel great about this? Aaron Rodgers definitely is experiencing some issues with those broken bones in his left wrist. Is Mason Rudolph going to be the guy to go this week? Neither of these guys are consistently getting the ball to their targets right now, though, so it's hard to trust either of these guys, even against Baltimore, who's still allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And on top of it, the Steelers just added Adam Thielen. So at what point in time does he become a factor in the passing game? If Aaron Rodgers were to play this week and you don't have any better options, you could still start DK Metcalf. But if Mason Rudolph were to start this week, I'm going to sit everybody. Pittsburgh is now allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game, so this should be a great matchup for Zay Flowers, but Lamar Jackson clearly has not been himself since returning from injury. At some point in time, hopefully he gets his feet under him and he's ready to go. He looks a lot better and he feels a lot better. But until then, even when Lamar Jackson was 100% healthy this season, Zay Flowers has not been consistent and he has not been safe. He also hasn't had a great ceiling either. For Denver and Las Vegas, it's more about who to start than whether you should start them, because Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin, to me, both have fantasy value, but I think they both can make life quite difficult for the other one. Courtland Sutton scored a touchdown last week in a favorable matchup, and Troy Franklin really was nowhere to be seen. But going into that matchup, Troy Franklin had been the much better wide receiver over the last few weeks. Sutton was the wide receiver 15 last week, and it was the first time in 4 weeks that he found himself inside the top 24, while Troy Franklin was consistently having a ceiling inside the top 24 during all of those games. So will it change back this week? Will it still be Courtland Sutton? This is why they have to be fringe starts. It's a great matchup, and I think you can play both of them, but who ends up being the guy? And Denver has been one of the best defenses all year long. Now they got Patrick Surtain back, and they allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I'm saying a big no to anybody on Las Vegas that's not named Brock Bowers in the pass game. Chicago at Green Bay. And for as good as Chicago has been playing, and even as a Lions fan, I'll give them their props. Ben Johnson is a good coach. I hated to see him go, and there's no ill will towards him. I really wish he would have went to somebody else that wasn't in the division. But Chicago is playing great. But for as good as they're playing, their wide receivers are making people furious in fantasy football. Luther Burden actually should probably be a little bit closer to a fringe start, but the ball's being spread around so often right now to all three of these guys, Colston Loveland, Cole Kmet, and they're having a ton of success running the football. It's really hard to figure out who's going to be the guy on any given week. Rome Odunze continues to be towards the top of the names and targets every single week, but he's not turning all those targets into fantasy points like he did at the beginning of the year. He continues to have the best ceiling. DJ Moore is let's say if Rome Odunze's ceiling is here and his floor is here, DJ Moore's ceiling is like right here and his floor is all the way down here. He's far riskier than Rome Odunze and he's done a lot less this season, but he still has a ceiling that's kind of in the same place. And I expect the Green Bay wide receivers to eat this week. Maybe not as good as they did against Detroit on Thanksgiving, but I still think we could see some really good games from Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Dontavian Wicks. If I had to list these guys in order, it would be Watson, Wicks, and Doubs in terms of upside. Doubs probably has the most touchdown potential because of his utilization in the red zone, but Christian Watson has the most big play potential, and Dontavian Wicks could end up continuing to see the most targets. For the LA Rams and the Arizona Cardinals, you start Puka Nacua because he's got one of the best floors. He is targeted by Matthew Stafford consistently. You start Davante Adams because of the touchdowns. I don't think I've ever seen a wide receiver that I can remember be so heavily utilized in the red zone as what Davante Adams has been this season. He landed in a great place. Matthew Stafford absolutely loves him, and it's hurt Puka Nacua's upside a little bit because he's not finding the end zone, but both of these guys are thriving together, and Matthew Stafford is an MVP candidate. And for the Arizona Cardinals, for Michael Wilson, a lot hinges on whether or not Marvin Harrison Jr. can end up playing this week. He's dealing with a heel injury right now, and it sounds like he's trending towards being able to play, but we don't know that for sure as of yet. If Marvin Harrison Jr. plays in this matchup against the Rams, I would list him as a fringe start. Michael Wilson probably stays as a fringe start for me, but I don't love it. If Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't play, Michael Wilson would move to a start for me based on the potential volume alone. But this offense has been so much better with Jacoby Brissett that you have to invest in at least one of these guys this week. For Houston at Kansas City on Sunday Night Football, a big thank you to CJ Stroud, who remembered that Nico Collins actually exists last week. Because the week prior with Davis Mills, he apparently forgot because he only gave Nico Collins 3 targets. But after getting 10 targets last week, it was the 5th time in 6 games that he saw at least double-digit targets. He's the big play guy and he's the volume guy. Jaden Higgins is seeing more and more work over the last few weeks and is now a fantasy viable candidate, even though this is a really tough matchup. This week, I wouldn't expect that much of a ceiling. Potentially maybe a red zone look for a potential touchdown, but outside of that, I don't think the ceiling is all that great. And Houston's defense is probably going to cause some problems for Kansas City on Sunday Night Football. I don't see Kansas City putting up 3 or 4 touchdowns this week. They're going to have to battle for some points, but we know Rashee Rice is going to be right in the middle of all of that. He is the one guy on this team right now that I feel like we can consistently look at every single week. Travis Kelce is up there with him in terms of consistency, but Rashee Rice has just been on a different level since returning from his suspension. Monday Night Football, Philadelphia at the Los Angeles Chargers. And what can we say about A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith? They're both fringe starts. The Chargers are allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And Philadelphia has basically force-fed A.J. Brown over the last couple of weeks. So it is conceivable that once again against the Chargers, he could end up being the guy. But based on a full season worth of workload, it's hard to just expect that going into this week. Either of these guys could be big play guys. Either of these guys could be absolute busts for us. If you're feeling it with A.J. Brown and you need upside, keep rolling with him. If you've got Devontae Smith, hopefully you've got some good, solid floor plays right around him to help offset any potential downward value that he gets if A.J. Brown has all the targets once again. And for the Chargers, Ladd McConkey has been the most consistent option for this wide receiver core since probably about the midway point of the season. He looks like the guy once again, and after the start of the season, there was a lot of concerns, but they returned the focus back to him after it was Keenan Allen to begin the year. And now Keenan Allen barely even plays unless it's 3 wide receiver sets. Quentin Johnston has touchdown potential every single week, and he's the guy with the most big play potential, but Ladd McConkey is the safest floor, and that's why he's going to be a start, and the other two guys are only fringe options. Headliner Nation, a whole lot going on in the world of wide receivers this week, so I hope for your fantasy team, you're all set, and you didn't really need a ton of help. But for those of you that are experiencing those difficulties, I hope that this video was able to kind of help you start setting your lineup and locking in who you want to play for you, whether it's your first week of your championship or you're trying to lock things up before you head into the playoffs. Headliner Nation, please do me a little bit of a favor. Before you head out of here, interact with the video in any way possible, whether it's just liking it. If you're a new person here, hit the subscribe button. Turn on the bell notifications if you've never done that. Hype the video, it doesn't matter. Whatever you can afford to do right now, we would greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.